What's going on, everybody? Mortem here, this time bringing you our final part in our Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire story series. Last we left off, in part 3, we needed to find our way to Ukaizo, where Aothis was headed. And in order to do that, we can either gear our ship up and get ready for that journey, or we can side with one of the 4 factions available in the game to help get us there. Now, with a piece of the Watcher's soul being inside of Aothis, we're going to use that connection to track him to the exact location of Ukaizo. Because through several side quests, we can learn the approximate location, but most people already know that it is meant to be somewhere past Andra's mortar and Magrin's teeth. So, in this particular episode, we are going to cover all the various ways and means you can side with these factions and then reach Ukaizo. Now, a couple of things I do want to mention at the start of this video. A lot of these quests are very interconnected and they are very reactive. I'm not going to mention every single possibility for every single quest. I'm just going to try to give you the broad strokes answers. Because, for instance, we're going to get into this in a bit, and you're watching a story video, so I'm going to go ahead and assume this isn't going to be a spoiler per se, or at least that you are expecting a spoiler. We're going to get to a part about stopping some slavers here in a bit. The Valen Trading Company doesn't care what you do with these slavers, they just need the situation resolved. The Rawatai, or the Royal Deadfire Company, want the slavers wiped out. The Principy want you to cut a deal with the slavers. The Huna wants you to recruit the Wahaki tribe, which is in direct conflict with the slavers. Regardless of how you play that situation out, that is not the lockout moment for any of these factions. So you can do basically the opposite, and while it will negatively affect your reputation if you do something that one particular faction doesn't like, it will not actually lock you out of the quest chain until you reach the lockout moments for each quest chain, or if you do something crazy like go on a murder spree and kill important characters or something, that will obviously lock you out pretty quickly. But my point being is there's a ton of interconnectivity and reactivity. So A, I couldn't mention all of it if I wanted to, more than likely. And B, most of it is honestly irrelevant to the overall plot, which is really what I'm trying to get across here. So with that point out of the way, let's jump right into the first of our factions, the Huna. The Huna are the ruling government, shall we say, of the Deadfire Archipelago. Now the Huna are actually a shadow of what they used to be, which was a dominating empire. So around the time of the Ingwithans, who eventually became the gods, so millennia ago, the Huna were actually one of the strongest peoples around. And the Ingwithans actually took advantage of that and used their resources to build the machinery that we mentioned from the last episode. Now what the Huna do still have going for them, and how they can potentially help you reach Ukaizo, is that they are water shapers. That is to say, they can effectively move water. Like think, I hate to make this comparison, but honestly the best comparison is like water bending from Avatar: The Last Airbender. It's exactly like that. They can 100% do all of that stuff. But in order to get into what the Huna can do for you, we first have to help them. As with all of these quests, you can actually start doing them at the beginning of the game, and then they unlock a little bit after each major plot point that we've covered in previous videos up to this point. So keep in mind, a lot of these quests you can do at any point in the game. You don't actually have to wait until the end of the game. But jumping into it, the first thing we're going to do for the Huna is we're going to solve a pirate problem. This is typically one of the first things you do in the game after reaching Nekataka. But the prince mentions that they have a pirate problem, and he's going to send you to investigate in the gullet. So after prodding around, you can eventually find your way to the Undercroft of Nekataka. And basically, apparently some rogue water shapers have been helping the Principy smuggle goods into the city. How you wrap up this quest affects the endgame with what happens to the Roparu in the gullet. The Roparu are the lowest caste of Huna society. So mostly all of this quest affects is pretty much what happens to the gullet. And beyond that, it's not super important to the main plot, so we're moving on. So after this happens, we get a much more interesting quest, which is we're being sent after an expedition that the prince sent to an island called Moterokosi, I think is how you pronounce it. I could be way off. But either way, he sent an expedition to that island looking for something, and they never returned, so he sends you there. When you show up, you are immediately threatened by members of the Oaxaca tribe. The Oaxaca tribe are very aggressive, isolationist members of the Huna. The Huna, of course, being made up of many tribes that ultimately all are under the umbrella of the Huna. In talking to them, however, if you choose to talk to them, you can find out that they are not responsible for the death of the expedition that was sent here. In their own words, the forest here has gone mad and killed the expedition on its own. So going forward, we can find out that the Oaxaca were pretty much in the right on this one. The forest here, through its Delmegan avatar, shall we say, has gone a bit insane. It seems to think it's healthy, but what it actually is rotting to the core. If you're a druid, you can actually cleanse this forest instead of fighting it, which I thought was a nice touch. But ultimately, in this forest, while you're at it, and what the expedition was actually after, was a early map of Ukaizo in relation to the other islands in the Deadfire archipelago. Now, your character mentions that it's not something you could use to chart a course, but again, it gives an approximate location of where Ukaizo would be. But again, most people already know the general gist of that anyway, so this isn't actually super helpful. Now, once we have this information, we can take that back to the prince, and he tells you that from here you're going to be working with the queen instead of just him, which is where we come to dealing with Queen Onikaza again. Now, the rest of the quests that I'm going to mention after this point, you actually have to have progressed a ways into the game to do for the Huna, that is. So the next major quest here is dealing with the Water Shapers Guild. As tensions begin to rise between all the factions, Queen Onikaza makes the very prudent move of trying to get her Water Shapers ready for what is probably going to be an inevitable conflict. So she summons them. However, they're not answering her summons, and she sends you to the Water Shapers Guild to investigate. This is honestly one of the cooler quests in the game, which you'll see why here pretty soon. When you get to the Water Shapers Guild, it's been attacked. There's a bunch of dead people. You investigate, you find some Water Shapers who explain that Naga have come up from the lower depths of the guild and began attacking people. The Guildmaster went down there to resolve the situation. When you make your way down and you reach the Guildmaster, she explains that the Naga have attacked and they've stolen her Rod of the Deep Hunter, which you're going to need to get into a door. She explains that there's something going on in there, it's very pressing, and it needs to be dealt with quickly. She unfortunately succumbs to the wounds that she sustained and dies. So we get this rod from the Naga that had already taken it. Then we go to the door she was speaking about. We solve a little puzzle with a song that she gave us. And when we enter, we find none other than this sea dragon. It turns out that Pariki, I don't know how to pronounce it, the first water shaper who actually turned the art form into like a teachable thing, actually lured this sea dragon here and captured it after the covenant that the Huna made with Andra, the goddess of the sea, which is what allows them to waterbend, was broken. They needed a power source from somewhere else. So originally, the dragon was just a guest. But after that covenant was broken, the dragon was basically forcefully bound to the Water Shapers Guild. Using some magic, they bound the Water Shaper forms to this cell. So when Water Shapers are actually doing their water shaping, they're no longer calling on the power of Andra herself. They're actually calling on the power of the sea dragon against its will. With the recent rumblings in the Deadfire, the prison the dragon was in was starting to loosen up, and it was able to call Naga forth to come free it. Now, ultimately, your decision here is a big one. You can kill this dragon outright. You can strengthen the wards that keep it imprisoned. You can free it. There is another option where you can actually, as a watcher, use your abilities to make sure only part of its soul stays imprisoned, so it's free to leave, but the Water Shapers can still call upon its essence to continue to do their work, which is ostensibly the best option for the Huna anyway, because this dragon gets freed and is no longer, angry about being trapped. Also, the Water Shapers can continue what they do, because if you just free the dragon, the Water Shapers will no longer be able to water shape, which is going to leave the Huna not defenseless, but close to it, because they're a relatively primitive tribal people otherwise in comparison to the other factions. So this is a big one. To reach Ukaizo, you need water shapers. That's their whole thing. So while it is still possible to continue with the Huna after this, it is difficult to do so. Now, this next part will actually only trigger depending on when it was supposed to be triggered. So if you wait until the end of the game to do all of the quests I just mentioned, you actually won't be given the recruit the Wahaki tribe part of this quest. For whatever reason, I don't know exactly what triggers it. What's supposed to happen next after this quest with the dragon is that you are sent to go recruit the Wahaki tribe for the Huna. That is, bring them back into the full fold. This ties in with the slaver thing that I mentioned earlier, because that slaver quest and all its interconnectivity is typically the end and the point of no return for a lot of the factions comes right after that. However, for whatever reason, if you wait until the end of the game, this doesn't seem to trigger appropriately for the Huna, and a couple of the other factions have some weird interplay if you wait until the end of the game for it, so just a quick note. But that's what would normally happen next. But after all that is done, the queen outright asks you, basically, if you are ready to commit to siding with the Huna and reaching Ukaizo. And this is the real point of no return for them. So if you agree to it, any companions that are against this will leave your party. And if you deny the request, your dealings with the Huna are pretty much done. They're like, all right, well, too bad then. So you pretty much have to pick another faction after that if you deny it. Should you accept it, what actually happens next is the Huna want you to sabotage the Valen Trading Company and the Royal Deadfire Company. You accomplish this by infiltrating a Royal Deadfire storehouse, blowing it up, and implicating the Valen Trading Company. And then reporting back to the queen, whose territory it is, so she settles the dispute, is basically like, yeah, this is on you guys, and she pits them against each other, effectively taking them both out in one fell swoop. And then after that, you sail to Ukaizo with the Huna. Let's move on to the Principy. So the Principy are, of course, the pirates of the Deadfire Archipelago. Now, the first quest you are given is actually called Blow the Man Down, and it is all about getting revenge on the pirate that attacks your ship at the very beginning of the game, Benwith. You are stopped after you leave Port Mage by a Captain Ferrante, who explains where you can find Benwith, and that basically you'd be doing him a favor by killing him as well. So you can go to Fort Deadlight, which is where Benwith is, and then that quest ultimately concludes with you either killing or sparing Captain Benwith. I would say most people are going to kill him because he's the worst. After this, once this quest is completed, Captain Ferrante will eventually contact you by letter and ask you to come visit him in Dunnage, the pirate city. He's got some work for you if you're interested, and if you go see him, he'll explain that recently several of his ships and people have been attacked by a seemingly ghost ship that they are calling the Floating Hangman. And he tasks you with digging up some information about it. So he sends you to the Temple of Barath in Nekataka, where the rival of the supposed captain of the Floating Hangman, Lucian Riven, supposedly was laid to rest. A guy named Aesir the Barbarian. And basically, you just need to go get some information from this tomb, basically anything you can, if there is any, to find. So once we go investigate this tomb, you can find out that the guy we're looking for had actually been turned into a death guard, which is to say he's an undead knight with all of his faculties in service to Barath. So he has possession of a sword that you're ultimately going to need for this part of the quest to continue. Not this particular quest, but you will need it later. You'll need to convince him to either give you the sword peacefully or kill him. It doesn't really matter which way you go with this, to be honest. And in addition to that, we're going to pick up some eulogy tablets, which will also give us more information about what is going on with Aesir here. This barbarian guy and Lucian, or whatever her name is, had a rivalry, shall we say, in life. And eventually, Lucia died and became a death guard herself. And Aesir followed her across the end of the world, really, until he was eventually killed and turned into a death guard himself. And now he guards the sword that the other woman was so desperately after. Like, that sword is her whole thing. She just really wants that sword. but he has it, and it is his Death Guard duty, shall we say, to guard it and keep it out of her hands. But you can convince him to give it to you. And once you have all that information, you can return to Captain Ferrante. And he'll basically start exploring ways to use that to his advantage to take control of the Floating Hangman. Because the pirate's plan on getting to Ukaizo is to take control of the Floating Hangman. Because what it'll actually do when it shows up is it clears all the weather, which means it can make it through Andra's Mortar, which is a giant storm on the way to Ukaizo, by simply using magic of the Floating Hangman to just dispel the weather around you and make for smooth sailing. Now, once this is done, you will be sent by Captain Ferrante possibly to go deal with the slavers, like I mentioned earlier. Now, preferably, Ferrante wants the slavers to continue their business, which you may or may not agree with. However, you resolve that quest will not lock you out of the Principy, like I mentioned earlier. But after this, you will be forced into a decision with the Principy, because what I haven't mentioned up to this point, because I was waiting to do so, is that you will ultimately get to decide the leadership of the Principy between Captain Ferrante and Captain Aeldus. The Principy is actually split into two sub-factions, the Old Blood and the New Blood, shall we say. Captain Ferrante leads the Old Blood, that is, pirates with principles, shall we say. And Captain Aeldus has the New Bloods. They're all about just, killing and plundering for the sake of doing so, as opposed to Captain Ferrante doing it as a means to an end. Captain Benwith actually served Captain Aeldus as her second in command. Back and forth between all these quests I've mentioned, you can actually report to Aeldus and Ferrante both and kind of give them information as you so choose. But ultimately this comes as a head because, you can't have both of them trying to go to Ukaizo. So Captain Ferrante will ultimately call a meeting where, using his position as top dog of the Principy ultimately, to call for the execution of Aeldus, which you can then either carry out or kill Ferrante, and basically you decide the future of the Principy with this quest. After which, it will be revealed that, and kind of during, honestly, that they have the information they need to find the Floating Hangman, using the sword that ideally you've already picked up to this point from the Death Guard in the Hanging Sepulchres, where we did the quest in Nekataka earlier. We can use a special phrase, which is like a motto or something of the paladin Lucia used to be, which will call the Floating Hangman to your location if you say that oath while holding the sword she's after. Now, regardless of which captain is alive at this point, this is what happens next. So if you don't have the sword already because you didn't get it earlier, you will have to go back to the sepulchres and get it. And then once you have it, all you've got to do is go out to sea on your boat, go down to the actual deck map, and then click on the sword from your inventory. It'll have a Speak the Oath option, where you can then, of course, speak the oath. And then you will be in direct confrontation with the Floating Hangman. You can convince this to end peacefully if you have the options, but most often you're going to wind up just fighting it out to the death. And I'm going to use this battle as a time to mention this. You're probably going to notice that I am just absolutely cleaning house and even one-shotted Lucia herself. That is actually not a bug or a cheat or anything like that. That is just a genuine one-shot. Undead are considered vessels. My ranger is using a weapon called the Red Hand, which has a special enchantment you can put on it called Double Tap, where if that weapon makes 2 consecutive hits on the same vessel target, it just immediately dies. In addition to the Double Tap enchantment, the Red Hand rifle also has a effect called Double Barrel, where it shoots 2 projectiles at once. So those 2 things combined means that if both of those projectiles hit a vessel target, it immediately dies. So to be clear, this is actually the highest difficulty that I'm playing on. What you're seeing is the Red Hand in action. It is ridiculous. It's such a good weapon. That aside, once you take control of the Floating Hangman from the Death Guard, what you're supposed to do is head back to Captain Ferrante, which then locks you in with the Principy. That is the point of no return. Once you return the Floating Hangman to the Principy, that is it. You are sided with them at that point. And then you head off to Ukaizo with them. You can get the Floating Hangman and then just never report back to the Principy. thus effectively taking the Floating Hangman. And we'll talk more about that later, because it is going to come up in the last section. For now, we're going to move on to the Valen Trading Company and the Royal Deadfire Company. So the Valen Trading Company are just merchants, essentially. They come from Old Vela. They use their money and wealth to influence, what they do. And essentially, they are in the Deadfire looking for luminous Adra. The Valen Trading Company is all about animancy research. Animancy being the study of souls. And in order to study souls, you need the essence of what those souls go through when they're headed to the afterlife, which is Adra. So they are there essentially to harvest luminous Adra, which is a very valuable commodity of late in the last couple years since the first game. The Royal Deadfire Company works for a nation called Rauatai. They are in the Deadfire Archipelago ultimately to assume military control of the place. They're all about their military. They have a very strong navy. The secret thing they're actually looking for is a means to stop the storms that are basically constantly assailing their home place of Rauatai. So Rauatai got to where they are by basically enduring just impossible conditions in their homeland. Rauatai is constantly racked by storms, very similar to the storms that seem to be causing Andra's mortar, which is what their goal in the Deadfire Archipelago is to establish control and then study these storms. Both the Valen Trading Company and the Royal Deadfire Company actually start the same way. They both send you to deal with a settlement named Tikawara and a ruins called Poko Kahara. This quest was actually heavily used in the promotional materials from the game and is probably the most recognizable quest because of that. But both of these factions start with this quest. The Valen Trading Company sent an expedition looking for luminous Adra to a place called Poko Kahara, and they stopped at a village called Tikawara on the way, which is where it's suggested you go to look for information first because no one knows exactly where Poko Kahara is. So you go to Tikawara, you investigate, you actually find a member of that expedition there who got sick the day before the voyage and, couldn't go. You talk to them, you talk to the local Huna tribe nearby, and they say that, this expedition came through, they left a couple weeks ago and then just never came back. And since they left, there are actually storms that are covering the island of Poko Kahara to the due east area of Tikawara. And, you're free to go there. The leader of the tribe will actually give you a key, which is why it's recommended you stop by Tikawara first. In addition to that, like I just mentioned, he'll give you the exact location of Poko Kahara, which is just due east from where you are now. If you do a little more digging from the information you're given, you'll find that the storms are supposedly a curse on the island that started recently. According to some members of the tribe here, that basically they didn't like outsiders and the sea is angry about outsiders going to the ruins. So from here you can sail to the ruins, you explore, because it's an abandoned island for the most part. You can start exploring, you find your way into the ruins, you find through your watcher abilities and things like that the expedition is mostly dead because a member of the crew seems to have went crazy. You'll eventually work your way down and find her body as well as her journal and things that describe what happened, as well as a small idol to Andra on her body. And then from here, we can finally reach the Adra pillar, but it's corrupted. And once you interact with it, a portal to the inside of the Adra pillar opens up. And if you go through it, you find yourself in the in-between. This is where things get interesting. You run into a member of the expedition that was sent to Poko Kahara, as well as the old spiritual leader of the tribe on Tikawara. Essentially, it turns out that the spirit of the old spiritual leader from Tikawara has been causing the storms. He did so by basically getting himself killed, not intentionally, but once he was killed, he used his own soul to stop the Adra pillar from doing what it does and channeling souls. And basically, it is overflowing with souls and is rotting because they're not flowing like they should. So you're actually forced to fight this guy. It kind of seems to imply you might be able to talk your way out of it, but you can't. You're going to have to fight this fight and kill all of these souls. And once you do, and they're all dispersed, you can decide whether to destroy or save the Adra pillar. Now, this is the difference between the Royal Deadfire Company and the Valen Trading Company for this. The Valen Trading Company wants the Luminous Adra, so you should restore it if you're siding with them. The Royal Deadfire Company wants it destroyed because that way the Valen Trading Company can't have it. Either way, regardless of your decision, the storms from the island will actually clear, because that's what was causing the storms as well as corrupting the Adra. So once you've made your decision, if you sail back to Tikawara and you speak to the new spiritual leader, which is actually the daughter of the old one, you can show her the idol you found on the expedition, and it turns out that that woman cursed that idol, gave it to the expedition, which led one of them to go crazy and start killing all of the other expedition members. This woman did this because, unlike her tribal leader, who welcomes outsiders and the trade they can bring, she was mad about outsiders being here, and she is essentially a reason that entire expedition died. So do with that information what you will. After this, you can report back to the leaders of each. The Royal Deadfire Company, while disappointed if you didn't destroy the Luminous Adra, what they are much more interested in is the fact that once you did or did not, or just dealt with that situation in general, that the storms around Pokokahara cleared. Because as I mentioned, that's their main goal for being in the Deadfire. Valen Trading Company is just happy you restored it and they can open up lanes of travel. So, focusing in on the Valen Trading Company from here. After that quest, you will be sent to investigate some smuggling, where you can find out that the Royal Deadfire Company has been supplying Principy with weapons to attack the Valen Trading Company. And you can also help with some animancy research. This is where we find out that Valen animancers have actually been experimenting with teleportation between Adra pillars. Essentially, using soul energy, they've been able to open up portals between one Adra pillar to the next. It's still in its infancy and it's not working very well, and you can take part in those experiments and kind of get them where they need to be. After all of that is sorted out, we can then be sent to deal with the slavers, again, like I mentioned. The Valen Trading Company actually doesn't really care how this plays out. They had a potential revenue source from the slave trading there. However, if you decide it's probably better to cut losses, they're fine with that as well. Basically, they just need the situation handled so their involvement isn't found out, or at least doesn't look too bad. So the Valen Trading Company is actually probably the most fine with whatever happens to the slavers. Once that is dealt with and we come back, we will be asked to sabotage the Royal Deadfire Company for the Valen Trading Company, which is essentially the same thing that the Huna wants you to do. However, this time, instead of framing them, the Valen Trading Company is just actually doing it. Now, this is the point of no return for the Valen Trading Company. If you have Mayo with you, which is the ranger for the Royal Deadfire Company, she's obviously not going to be a fan of that and she'll leave your party. But once you've dealt with that situation, the Valen Trading Company's way of getting to Ukaizo through the storms is to actually use their animancy teleportation. They're going to bring an Adra pillar onto a ship, and then you're going to teleport from that Adra pillar to an Adra pillar on Ukaizo, which is how they get you through the storms. Now, circling back to the Royal Deadfire Company. They're actually probably the most straightforward people to work with, actually, in terms of the quests. So once you deal with Pokokahara, you'll be sent to a place called Sayuka as a courier. Sayuka is a research facility for the Royal Deadfire Company where they're clearly working on something. In your role as a courier, you'll find out that whatever that is involves a spell that was recently created to recycle air. Some woman has mastered a spell to recycle air, and whatever that is, it's important to the research going on in Sayuka. In Sayuka, you will be given some kind of busy work, really, to help the research station. You don't really find out exactly what they're doing unless you're really good at, using some inference clues. They do not ever come out and say what you're actually doing. What you wind up doing quest-wise is simply helping problems around the research facility. For instance, they are being attacked by druids from the island who aren't happy about their presence there, as well as there being a problem with some sort of facility nearby Sayuka that is emitting energy that is just blowing up animals and stuff to like insane sizes. And you'll be sent to deal with that, which actually turns out to be an old Engwithan ruin under the dominion of the god Galawain. And you can resolve that situation literally however you want. It does not make a difference for the Royal Deadfire Company. You'll lose some reputation if you don't do what they want, but it doesn't matter otherwise. And then after that, the Royal Deadfire Company will send you to deal with the slavers as well. Now, the Royal Deadfire Company want the slavers routed. They want to establish control over the archipelago, and doing that will A, get rid of, slavers being a nuisance, but also it will endear them a bit to the Huna that are, locals, not necessarily the crown, but like the actual Huna people. So the Royal Deadfire Company wants you to go wipe out the slavers, which you can do for them. And then after that comes the point of no return for the Royal Deadfire Company. Theirs is probably the most radical in terms of like end games. So what the Royal Deadfire Company want you to do is actually go assassinate the Huna leadership, which is the prince and the queen. You don't have to kill the queen if you choose this option. You can kill the prince, and then if you don't kill the queen, she just like runs away in exile, basically. But they want you to kill both. And once this is done, again, if you have anyone aligned with the Huna, say Tekehu, they will obviously leave your party if you do this. Once you return to the Brass Citadel, which is the Royal Deadfire Company headquarters, they unveil what they've been researching, which is actually a submarine, or the first version of a submarine in this world. That's why they were looking into recycled air earlier. And they're going to get by the storms guarding Ukaizo by going underneath them, which is how they get to Ukaizo. Now that pretty much does it for actual factions. However, there are two other ways to get to Ukaizo. Both of them involve just going by yourself. One of them involves the Floating Hangman, and the other one involves upgrading your ship to the maximum level. So, because we've already discussed the Floating Hangman and the fact that it is incredibly straightforward, as I mentioned earlier, when you actually take control of the Floating Hangman, you are not locked into the Principy option until you take the Floating Hangman back to Dunnage. If you instead just take the Floating Hangman straight to Ukaizo, or just, sail around, do whatever you want to do, and then when you're ready, go to Ukaizo without ever going back to Dunnage, you've effectively betrayed the Principy by using their information to take control of the magic ship that will get by the storms to Ukaizo, and then just cutting them out of the deal. So that is the easiest way to get there by yourself. The other option used to be easy, but no longer is. So the other option of upgrading your own ship to the absolute maximum used to be really easy. Prior to one of the, I think, DLC patches actually, you could just buy the upgrades from the shipwright in Nekataka. They were very expensive, but that was it. You could just buy them. However, one of the DLC patches actually changed that. What you need are the Dragonwing sails and the Blackwood hull. After this patch, they moved the Dragonwing sails to a very high-level part of the map, as well as turning the Blackwood hull into a crafting recipe. So, Blackwood logs are very rare. There's only like 6 or 7 of them in the game. You need 5 of them and a ton of gold to craft the Blackwood hull. And you have to do both of those things to upgrade your ship to the max, to then use your own personal ship to sail through to Ukaizo. Because that's such a pain, it's honestly easier to just get the Floating Hangman and then use that to sail yourself through to Ukaizo. But those are the two options for just taking yourself there. At some point, there's not an exact moment for this, but at some point through all of this, as you're getting ready to go to Ukaizo, you're going to speak to the gods as they stop you on your ship, and they're going to be a bunch of back and forth about what to expect on Ukaizo, and the main two things you're going to get from that conversation are there is a guardian that guards the gates of Ukaizo that you're probably going to have to fight. And by probably, I mean you're going to have to fight it. In addition to that, they also spill some really cool lore about the godlike. So the godlike are technically a race of their own in Pillars lore. So the godlike are essentially normal fetuses and stuff that were touched by gods in the womb, thus becoming godlike. So because of that, you'll find godlikes of basically all statures and stuff of other races. So there are Skane godlike, there are Andra godlike, there are Magrin godlike, there are Bareth godlike, all of that stuff, and they all come in various shapes and sizes because, again, If two Orlans have, a kid that winds up being touched by Galawain, they're going to give birth to a nature godlike. Some societies see it as a blessing. When you get like a Skane godlike, he has like a mutilated body. A lot of people see that as a bad omen, and the baby is often killed. The lore that they give you about these godlike is that the gods are actually capable of harvesting their godlike's souls to give them more power. So for instance, if say Magrin needed more power for some reason, she could just snap her fingers and all the fire godlike, or as many as she pleases, would just die, and she could reabsorb them for power, which is just a big lore reveal that they wind up not doing anything with in this game at the very least, but just, there you go, there's the information. Now, once we actually sail through to Ukaizo, which involves a scripted event that plays out through the random adventure text stuff, once we actually get to Ukaizo, though, we are going to be immediately confronted by the Guardian. We can use the opportunity to speak to the Guardian, who can tell us a little information about Ukaizo, but it's nothing we wouldn't have already learned up to this point, that the Nguithans came to the Huna Empire, basically tricked the Huna into building the machines. The Huna thought they were something different, but the Nguithans knew that that was the machinery that they were going to use to take control of the wheel. You can learn all that from the Guardian, should you so choose, but you can learn it from other sources up to this point. Here you're going to fight the Guardian. So this is the last boss. Technically, go crazy. There is one fight after this, but it is not the last boss. This guy is the last boss. Fairly decently tough fight. It's 3 phases, but it's not too bad. On lower difficulties, it's actually pretty easy. On Path of the Damned, you got to pay attention to what you're doing, the hardest difficulty, so that's pretty much expected anyway. But, kill the ads, then kill the boss. That's pretty much the strategy. Now, once we put down the Guardian and we can actually enter Ukaizo, we need to make for Andra's Pillar, where we can shut off Andra's Mortar, which is the storms. So we can hit a button that shuts off the storms, and in doing so, actually stops the storms on Rawatai by default, which is kind of interesting, I guess. From here, we can have a conversation with all the members of your party that you've brought with you. They'll have some things to say. You can have a nice touching moment. And then when you come down from the spire, you are going to be attacked by whatever leader is still alive that you slighted the most. So this has nothing to do with what faction you sided with. It has to do with what faction leader you slighted the most. So for instance, I sailed here with the Floating Hangman for the sake of wrapping this up. And in doing so, you've effectively betrayed whichever captain of the Principy is alive. For me, it happened to be Captain Ferrante. And you'll be forced to kill them. And if you've beaten the last boss, this fight should be, not difficult at all, really. So once you kill these guys, you can go to the part of the city that Aothis is actively destroying, which is, the part that houses the machinery. And then you can go have a conversation with Aothis. Some of the conversation options here will affect an inslide. You can basically ask Aothis, to do certain things after he destroys the wheel to, help make things easier for people. And that will affect the end. The end is, in fact, that the Watcher of Cadnua bears witness to Aothis destroying the wheel. And the gods are basically well, I guess this is what it is. We're going to have to figure it out. Because in destroying the wheel, Aothis has officially stopped the cycle of reincarnation. The wheel did exist before the gods. They have controlled it for so long that once it's destroyed, it will no longer work again. It's not going to magically go back to its pre-god state, where it just did it by itself. And then, of course, we see the end of the game with all of the slides that represent the actions you took throughout the game. And this is going to vary by person to person, so it's hard to say exactly what you'll get. But the general gist of it is that the mortals are going to have to deal with the wheel being broken. So what this means in logistical terms is that there's about a generation or two from now where people will no longer be born anything but Hollowborn. So Hollowborn are people who are born without souls, which is what the wheel actually gives people. After that point, people will still be born, but they'll be Hollowborn. They won't have a soul. They'll essentially be just empty husks of people. So essentially, mortals have a generation or two to figure out another solution or work with the gods to find another solution that works for everyone, as Aothis wanted. Now, I actually mentioned this a couple times, I believe, up to this point. I did want to mention something about what happens to the Watcher in the Beast of Winter DLC. I firmly believe that Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire is the end of the Watcher of Cadnua's story because of what happens in that DLC. I'm not going to spoil it, just in case anybody wants to go play it, or I do separate videos or something at some point. The Beast of Winter DLC ends with the Watcher trapped and having to have a conversation with Rimmergand. Beyond that, I'm going to leave it pretty wide open. In order to escape where he is trapped from, the Watcher of Cadnua has to make a deal with Rimmergand. Rimmergand is the god of entropy and true death, like an end to all things. No reincarnation, no nothing. Rimmergand makes a deal with the Watcher that in order to escape the place that he's trapped in, Rimmergand is going to, after this life, essentially give a true ending to the Watcher's soul. This life will be his last, his or hers. So, because of that, I think that this is going to be the last game of the Watcher's cycle for Aora as well. I think this is going to be the last game for the Watcher as far as this series and franchise goes. Now, of course, we know Avowed is coming already, so there will be more Pillars of Eternity. However, I think this is the end of the Watcher's story. And personally, I thought it was really good. That's going to wrap it up, guys. There it is. There is the story of Pillars of Eternity 2 Deadfire. I did Pillars of Eternity 1 already, so there's the story of these two games. I really hope you guys enjoyed it. This last one was a lot of work, so hope you like, comment, subscribe. Please stick around. I plan on doing more stuff like this in the future. The channel is doing really, really well. So honestly, just thank you guys so much for watching. Cannot thank you enough. Maybe even think about joining the channel as a member. That would actually help out a lot as well. But regardless, thank you so much for watching. May you wander in wisdom and have an amazing day.